Should I get started? Yeah? Cool. So hi everyone. My name is Sydney Swaine Simon. I'm with NeurotechX. Melanie was supposed to be here as well today, but unfortunately she had to stay back in Montreal. NeurotechX, we're a non-for-profit organization which is essentially about community building and promotion around neurotechnology. And specifically the thing that I'm very much interested in is an accessible neurotechnology. So some of the things that we like to do is we like to network, we like to teach, we like to build different types of open source projects. So we have a relatively active GitHub, and we just want to kind of grow together. We have different chapters across the world, so we have about 18 chapters worldwide, most of them in North America and Europe. But if you are ever in any of these locations, feel free to look us up and get connected with your local community. So the way I wanted to kind of start the talk is just to kind of briefly mention what neurotechnology is. As I was talking at the booth downstairs, at the biohacking booth, what came across is that some people, they have different interpretations as to what neurotechnology represents. And so you can kind of see from the screen here some of the kind of the classical ones that you think about when you're thinking about neurotechnology. So on the top left, you have an MRI machine. On the top right, you have a TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation. Coincidentally, this is also a TDCS. So we have these TDCS badges at the Biohacking Village. And if I press this little button right here, I'm actually creating phosphenes, or artificial light, in my eyes. So the current is running across my optic nerve and is creating this artificial light to be present in front of me. You have things like EEG, or electroencephalography, which is essentially a voltmeter for your brain. And then you have things like TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a big magnet to induce your neurons to fire off. I also like to do stupid things. Like not have the video play. So anyways, what was supposed to be happening here is, so I have a few RFID and NFC implants as well. So I use one of the implants to be able to get into work. So what you're supposed to be seeing here is me being able to access, oh, there you go. Okay, I just gotta click on it. So I'm just kind of showing that the door is locked. Put my hand over it, and now you can get it. Magic. And I have another one as well over here, which is an NFC implant. And I just do this more for party tricks, just because people are still kind of impressed by this. But yeah, so there you go. Reason why I'm here to talk today is about brain-based authentication. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with what a biometric is and what biometric authentication is. Essentially, it's just using some form of biosignal to be able to use it as an identifier. It could be things like physical traits, like your blood vessels, your facial features, or your fingerprint, or it can be more behavioral, like the way that you walk or the way that you type. Usually when you're thinking about biometric, and there's 7 factors that you should be considering when selecting one. So you should be thinking about the universality. So does the target population that you want to identify have it? Is it something that's unique for each individual? Is it something that remains permanent with those individuals? Is it something that you can measure? How well does it perform as a biometric? So can you do it in a very robust fashion? Is it something that people are going to acceptingly use as a biometric? And the more important one, is it something that you can easily simulate or fake or kind of just circumvent it? So the realm of brain biometrics has been growing in popularity in the past 5 years or so, with about 100 publications being released. There's this really active guy in Italy that's been writing a lot about it. So I'll give you his name later on if you're interested in seeing some of his research. It became more of a popular thing in 2012 as there was this project that was done as part of the Human Connectome project, which was looking at MRI scans based on different types of tasks and seeing if they can use that as a method of identification. So from the picture here, you can see that the R1 has a 0.99 level of identification. That just means resting state. So I was looking at the resting state, essentially just a person standing still and not doing anything for 2 minutes. But you don't need an MRI to do brain-based authentication. You can actually do it with much cheaper technology. In the past 10 to 15 years, there's been kind of a revolution within the realm of neurotechnology where it was, primarily seen in contexts like this before, very much in a research setting. And, you had these massive wires that be coming out of this EEG cap. But now you have form factors and costs and designs that are, relatively cheap. Cheapest one you can find is about $100 US. If you make it yourself, you can potentially get it cheaper, but that depends on where you get your parts. But you're usually looking between, let's say, $200 to $600 or $700. The other thing that you kind of have to understand before going into how you can use the brain as an authentication tool is how do you build an interface with the brain in the first place. So many people, who here has heard of the term brain-computer interface? Raise your hands. All right, so still some people who haven't heard about it, so I'll go a little bit more in detail about this. Essentially what a BCI is, it follows this kind of diagram. So it's some form of technology that's interfacing into the brain and then eventually kind of creates this feedback loop, which then can influence the brain activity so that it'll change it for the future classification of that mental state. So first it starts off with you generate a certain amount of brain activity, then you have to acquire that signal from the brain, you have to digitize it, you have to get the features of the signal that you're acquiring, you have to build a classifier, take that classifier, and then put that into a feedback device. So when we're talking about brain activity, essentially when we're talking about brain activity that we're interested in looking at, which is with EEGs, essentially you can capture brain activity with an EEG when there's enough neurons that fire off in a dynamic sense and collectively that it generates a small amount of electromagnetic activity. There's two main types of brain activity that you're looking for, event-related potentials and oscillatory processes or neural oscillations. Neural oscillations are essentially rhythmic patterns of brain activity that naturally occur within the brain. So a layman term that's used quite often is brainwave. This is essentially what a neural oscillation is. So you kind of see two examples of one, what kind of like the raw EEG activity would look like when you're awake versus when you're asleep. And you can kind of see there's, a difference between the two. Here's me doing kind of like more of a live example here. So I close my eyes, and I don't know how easy it is to see, but you can kind of see there's a change in the activity that's being produced. The other one is event-related potentials. Essentially, the way to think about an ERP is when you're presented a stimuli, usually between maybe 100 to 700 milliseconds later, you're going to see a change in potential value occur within the brain. Okay, so for example, on the bottom right graph there, so actually the video here, what this is a P300 speller. So the individual is looking at a specific letter, and it's when the letter finally flashes, it's going to create a P300 response. So flashing light occurs, 300 milliseconds later, there's a positive potential change that occurs. And on the bottom right there, you can kind of see how you kind of call them. So P100, positive potential change at the 100 millisecond point. So the graph is inverted, the Y value is inverted, so it's all positive values below the x-axis. But that's the basic idea. This is kind of like another way that you can kind of visualize it. So eventually you're going to see this rapid peak. So you saw there was this, on the red line, there was just that very big peak of activity that occurred out of nowhere. So now that you kind of understand how you acquire brain activity, or what brain activity looks like, you now have to acquire the signal. So the technology that is most commonly used is an EEG or electroencephalography. You can think of it as a voltmeter for your brain. So it's just measuring the changes of electrical activity that occur naturally. So this is a research grade EEG that is being put on the person right now. When it comes to actually, I think, yeah. So if you look at the top right, the main components that you're working with an EEG is you have the electrodes. The electrodes then connect to an amplifier, and then you just have to do an analog to digital conversion. So there's different types of electrodes that you can use as part of an EEG. You can either work with wet or dry electrodes. Wet electrodes require you to put some form of conductive paste between your head and the electrode itself. The reason why you'd want to do this is because you get a much better quality signal, but the obvious downside is that you get paste in your hair. With dry electrodes, it's a little bit easier to use on a day-to-day basis, except the quality of the signal tends to be much worse. You can either do passive or active electrodes. Passive electrodes, I wish I brought my stuff, but passive electrodes is essentially just a conductor material that runs through a wire, which will then connect to the amplifier on the board itself. So the beauty of this type of design is that it's much easier to work with multiple electrodes and it's cheaper per electrode. However, you can also have an active electrode where you have the amplifier directly attached to the electrode itself. However, this comes at a much bigger cost, and it's more difficult to put multiple of them on your head at the same time. So once you kind of understand how these electrodes work, there's a standard method that you use in terms of actually placing them on your head called the International 1020 system. And essentially it's just taking, the difference between here and here, here and here, and measuring 10 or 20% respectively. So on the left here, I took an overhead picture of my friend and I just kind of overlaid what it would look like on him. So once you have the electrodes placed and you're starting to get signal in, you have to do a little bit of pre-processing. So pre-processing just essentially means that you're getting this raw signal and you want to remove any form of artifacts. You want to make sure that you have a bandpass filter so you're not getting all frequencies of activity. You just want to make it a little bit more easy to work with that signal. Once you have done that, this is where you would get the feature extraction involved. So since it's way too complex and the signal is very raw, you have to start to do some mathematical operations on it to actually get some features that you could actually work with. So here's another graph kind of showing. So these are different frequencies of brain activity, and you'll see in a second here how they kind of all merge into this kind of like raw EEG activity, right? So this is what it kind of looks like regularly, but you can decompose it. From there, you want to be able to build your classifier. So, there's different ways you can do it. There's linear and non-linear methods, so you can work with linear discriminant analysis, support vector machines, neural networks, Gaussian classifiers, which was something built specifically for BCIs, or you could take non-linear approaches as well. And this is where you then get into the feedback mechanism, and this is what you tend to see most times when you search for BCIs is videos like this. So on the left there, that is a brain-controlled drone, and this was a competition that was done at the University of Florida where they had the students race against each other by just controlling the drone to go across and try and beat the competitors. And on the right here, this is an open BCI, so it's an open source EEG that's connected to an open prosthetic. And so he's actually not using EEG activity here, he's actually using his jaw clench, but he's using it to open and close the hand. So that's the basics of what a BCI is. Well, now that you kind of understand that, what you need to then understand is how can you take this system and actually build a form of authentication with it. So I talked a little bit about ERPs and neural oscillations, and you can actually use these two different types of brain activities to build a method of authentication. So one well-known study using an ERP asked for individuals to stare at a bunch of different pictures, and they were looking for a specific picture. So say they were shown 20 pictures in a row, and eventually they would see the picture that was theirs. This target picture would be their ID. So it would be looking at the brain response that occurred when it saw the target picture, and it would generate what I believe a P300 response. And using this type of system, you can actually get an accuracy of about 97.6%. And there's been other designs that have kind of mimicked this that have been just as good. The one that I'm more interested in is in resting state, just because it requires a lot less setup, and all you really have to do is just stand still for 2 minutes with an EEG on your head. So you essentially would be looking at the different brain waves and how they kind of fit together, and depending on where you place the electrodes, you can get different levels of accuracy as to predicting specific individuals. So from the graph here, if you look at the O1, the POZ, and the O2 location, which is placing the electrodes back here, you can use that brain activity. You ask a person to sit still for 2 minutes, and you can collect enough samples where you can accurately predict who they are at a 98% accuracy. The thing that potentially why this is possible is because there's evidence with alpha and beta rhythms that they carry individual traits which are being claimed to be genetically induced. So there is a genetic factor that goes into it. And just kind of like a small side point, if you are thinking of doing this, make sure you're always looking at brain activity below 40 hertz. The next question you may be having is, should I be using this to protect your stuff at home or work? And the short answer is no. This is an absolutely terrible method of doing authentication or any form of control in your house, and I totally advise you not to do it at this point. But the more longer answer is, if you go back to our 7 factors, you can kind of see a picture that's coming out. So if you look at the universality, it depends on the type of brain activity that you're looking at. So for example, if there's a type of brain activity called motor imagery, which is the idea of imagining yourself doing some form of motion with either like your right hand or your left hand or your feet. And 30% of people can't actually generate that type of activity. So if you use that as a method of authentication, it's not going to work very well. Uniqueness, this still has to, I think, be studied a little bit more because we're still very much at the early stage and we don't know how much overlap there is between one person to another. Permanence, this is also a very tricky thing because EEG readings can be the most trickiest thing in the world to do because so many different factors will influence your brain activity from one day to another. So say, for example, you get a concussion, you're screwed. You can't use that same method of authentication because your brain's just completely messed up. Even if you're just really tired, it will completely mess with the signal. So, if you have someone coming in the morning and they have to authenticate and they spent the whole night, working on something, it's just not going to work very well. Measurability, this is another thing that where it really suffers. So it really depends on the type of headset and the environment where it's being recorded, so you have to be conscious of that. Performance, it's not one of these technologies that are very robust, and there still has to be a lot of work done to improve this. And acceptability, this might be also a little bit tricky as well because you need to have the appropriate form factors. So because of the fact that if you're asking a person to put 56 electrodes on their head and put a bunch of paste in their hair, and you have to do this on a regular basis, it just makes no sense, right? However, circumvention, I think this is where EEG tends to have its biggest strength. Because it's a dynamic biosignal, it means that, say, for example, one system becomes compromised. So say, for example, you're looking at resting state, you could essentially switch to an ERP and you could still use your brain as a form of authentication, which I think is really awesome. You could even test if you have a live signal coming in by doing like a random SSVP, which stands for steady state visual evoked potentials. Essentially, if you flash a light at a specific frequency, that generates a strong enough response in the brain that it's easily acquired by an EEG. So this is a good way to kind of see if you're getting a live signal or not. However, it's still not perfect, and because, a lot of the consumer grade EEGs that are out there, they're IoT devices, you can essentially do a man-in-the-middle attack, and, you're fucked. So, there's many people that have looked at EEGs and tried to do man-in-the-middle attacks, and because when people are building biotechnology, they're not actually thinking about security, it's not going to be very, very difficult to do this. So, Sid, why would you come all the way from Montreal to tell us not to do this? And people, I am your salvation, okay? I'm here to save you from yourself. Just because I don't want you to do it, it doesn't mean that Scrooge McDuck over here is not going to try and sell you on something. So the one thing that I've come across on quite often within the realm of neurotechnology, every so often you'll see a really, really shitty Kickstarter or a really, really shitty Indiegogo that is trying to sell you some form of neurotechnology device that does absolutely nothing of value. This is my favorite. So they're essentially what they're doing here is they're doing this magnetic coil that they place on the back here, and it's supposed to change your brain activity based off of the frequency of the magnetic coil, or I don't know. But anyways, they made $200,000 of sales on Indiegogo. Like, there was 1,696 backers of this, which is mind-boggling. And just to kind of show you how stupid this is, they're saying that you can get enough energy from your goddamn audio jack to actually connect to the back of your head where it's actually influence your brain activity. No! It doesn't work that way. The other thing that becomes very obvious with a lot of these Kickstarters is that, the people that are building them are, they really should not be building EEGs. So this product is called the Superbrain. It was, once again, this thing that I was trying to sell you, this whole idea of doing like neurofeedback, but it was like, no, it made no sense what they were trying to claim. And if you look at their team, it's a bunch of engineers, but not a single neuroscientist. So they probably got like their own consumer EEG at one point, or they built their own. They're like, oh wow, look, we can do this amazing thing. But they really didn't understand the brain at all. So what I kind of see with a lot of these products is essentially becoming 21st century snake oil. And so what I want you guys to be aware, before you go, if say someone comes and tries to sell you on a biometric, an EEG biometric or a brain-based authentication tool, you really have to make sure you ask yourself the appropriate questions. However, I'm not saying you can't. You could definitely make it for fun if you want. I think it's really cool, to try and do some form of authentication just by, using your brain. But before you do, there's a few things you need to consider, and you can use this advice as well as if you ever get approached by someone that wants to sell you on something. Do different multiple forms of authentication if you are going to be working with EEG. So even something as simple as with Android devices, you can kind of do like a pattern of, but they also require for you to have a PIN as well, just in case you forget your pattern of activity. So, have different levels of authentication just because we don't know how well EEG as a biometric will work in the long term. Also, a lot more field testing has to occur. It works really well potentially in a controlled environment, but if you're going out in the field, you're not going to get very good results. The other thing you have to consider is it's not going to work with populations that don't want to do it. So if you do this with a prison population or a captured population or whatever, they can just essentially not do the task that they're being told to do, and it just completely messes it up. The other thing you have to consider when it comes to anything related to neurotechnology or neuroscience is that innovation tends to be very, very slow in the field. So, if you're waiting for it to come, you may have to wait a little while. So this is Dr. Guy Rouleau. He's based out of the Montreal Neurological Institute in Montreal, and he has been pushing for open neuroscience for the past little while now. And this kind of shows to you where we stand within the realm of neuroscience. We're just at the point right now where we're creating open databases around neurodata. And it's very, very difficult. It took a long time just to get to this point. The other thing you have to consider is that if you're doing any form of experiment, if you're doing it in a research context, there's a lot of things that stop you from being able to get started right away. Working with research-grade EEG tends to have a very high cost associated with it, and you also always have to go through ethical approvals. And if you're trying to get something particular that's not very well understood, you may not get good results just because of the fact that the brain is relatively complex. The other thing you have to consider when doing any form of BCI design is that there's a lot of factors that go into doing it well. So this is some of the things that you have to be considering when designing any form of EEG system. So you got to make sure you have a good signal-to-noise ratio. You got to be sure that it's something that you can wear comfortably. You got to make sure that it's secure, it's safe, that the cost is relatively low, that it's fashionable, I guess, if that matters. But there's a lot of things that you really have to consider. And to kind of give you an idea of what you should be thinking of in terms related to cost, functionality tends to drop quite a lot versus usability, right? So some of the consumer grade EEGs, they look very nice and they're relatively cheap, but you can't really do much with them. The other thing you really got to understand is that you need to have a good experimental design or a good experimental protocol. And this is something that has messed me over so many times just because I didn't take the time to acquire the EEG activity properly. So reach out to people that are doing their studies in neuroscience. They're very, very nice, and most of them will like the fact that someone wants to talk to them. So go and talk to them. Never cut corners. Realize that neuroscience research does take a lot of time to do it properly. To give you a use case of where I messed up once. So we did one trial with brain authentication where we were working with known versus unknown acronyms. So based off of the ERP response that would be generated by the brain, based off of if you know an acronym versus you don't, it would create an N400 response. However, we cut a lot of corners because we were running short on time. And what happened is that we only got about 10 minutes of data when we actually needed closer to 45. We controlled everything else. We were working with research-grade EEG. That device that the person is wearing is a biosemi, which is like a $100,000 machine. And we were in this massive Faraday cage, so there was no kind of electrical interference, but it still failed. So, how do you make your own? Well, there is enough parts out there right now that it makes it relatively easy to start to try and make your own. You can either go down the free option, There's more and more databases of EEG activity that are out there that you could potentially look at. The Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience, which is based out of San Diego, they have a list of EEG databases that exist, and you could take a look at some of those. There's some resting state data in there, and you could try and build a classifier with that. And you can either use Octave, SciPy or MNE, which is MNE is a really, really great tool for EEG and MEG data as well. If you're interested in looking at some of the papers, I would recommend taking a look at Patrizio Campisi's research. He's probably the most active researcher in the domain. So this is what your system will kind of look like if you so this is more of a live system. So if you actually do want to kind of acquire your own hardware and do this yourself, these are the different components that you're going to need to work with. So in the top left there under signal acquisition, that's an OpenBCI. So you just need an EEG. You're going to need a cap just to place the electrodes. You can use something as simple as like what I'm wearing right now, which is just like a standard headband to keep them in place. But you just got to make sure that there's good contact. And then you can use something like CypherCon, which is a Python library to do EEG experiments with. You can also, for feature extraction, I already mentioned a few of them. You can work with MNE, you can work with Scikit. If you do want to work with MATLAB, you can work with EEG Lab, but we're more advocates of open source. And you can also take a look at OpenVibe, which is kind of more this drag and drop interface to do EEG work with. And it's a pretty cool system. And then for the feedback, you could either work with CypherCon or OpenVibe. So some of the hardware that is available for you, you could either try to do something with the NeuroSky. There was one paper that I saw, they were working with a single electrode. So this is a single electrode system, and they were able to get a relatively good result. A more popular option is working with the Emotive. So the Emotive is a 14-channel EEG, but it tends to be a little bit more expensive. And the thing that I don't necessarily like is that they make you pay $49 a month to do 50 sessions. So this is really targeting researchers, and they've really pivoted on their model because very much at the beginning they were targeting, consumers, but now, they realize that the money's not there. You can also go with the Muse. The Muse is a relatively simple EEG. It's just electrodes that you place over your forehead. I haven't really tried to do it with resting state, but you might get some interesting results. But the more popular one is the OpenBCI when it comes to makers. So it's an open source EEG. You could either get 4 or 8 electrodes, and they also provide the build of materials and the schematics with it if you ever want to just build it yourself. The OpenBCI is also a pretty good option simply because of the fact that it's been shown to work on different types of ERP responses. So someone has built a P300 speller with an with an OpenBCI, and they got relatively good results. There's also a few papers that have been published recently that have shown that that consumer-grade EEG is just as good, maybe a little bit worse, as research-grade EEG. This is going to be your cost that you're going to have to think about. So if you're working with an 8-channel OpenBCI, will be about $500 US, 4 channels, $200. If you include all the parts, if you want to work with wet electrodes, the cost will be a little bit more. But if you want to work with dry, it'll cost you about $270. So with that, if you are interested in building your own, or if you want to have more open discussions in the domain, I invite you to, number one, check out our GitHub at github.com/neurotechx, and then we have a few projects there that might be interesting for you. The Awesome BCI is this non-exhaustive list of EEG resources or neurotechnology resources that you can learn a little bit more about that. We're currently working on Neurotech EDU, which is going to be our open education platform to actually teach you all this stuff. And you can also take a look at the friend of mine's GitHub at puzzleblocks.io. He creates open source EEG tools, or toys rather. But if you do want to join us on NeurotechX, we have a relatively active Slack group, and you can always join the EEG biometric channel. Thank you. Do I take questions?
Have at it.
All right. Questions?
Real quick, we only have 1 minute, right?
Yeah. No. So would I recommend a concussion? No. Don't. Just delete the data.
Obviously, you know our research here, so how soon do you think, like,
It's a difficult question, but I would say there's a few things that have to be improved. So the robustness of these systems is definitely one of those things that really have to be figured out. I think that as the machine learning gets a lot better within the domain, it will speed up the process of making these systems a little bit more robust. And as more material science is looked into and so on and so forth, it may improve it. I would say, I don't know, I'd be making up a number, but I'll just say 5 years. Yeah, with the baseball cap, that introduces other issues. So you'd have to make sure that the electrodes are placed properly. It's still the same issues, right? You still have to require a lot of data from a specific individual. And with the baseball cap, the issue is say if it moves, you won't be able to see that it moves, right? So like most of the designs of EEG caps actually allow for you to see where the electrodes are placed just to make sure that it's being done properly. But with the cap, it's just not visible. In the back? So the question is if someone with MS or Alzheimer's could authenticate. Actually, I think that would go against the authentication. It probably would just create a lot more problems than value, but I can't say with 100% certainty. Is there a question in the back? Like what? So, I mean, I can generate phosphine, so I can introduce like a fake light just using TDCS. But hallucinations, I guess, no, not really. I mean, I've used the Muse as a meditation tool, and, but it's not really causing me to it's not causing me to hallucinate. It's just giving me a method to determine how well I'm meditating. Actually, I think it's kind of oxymoronic if you think of a neurofeedback meditation tool, because if you're always kind of like thinking about the fact that how well you're doing while you're meditating, you're not actually meditating. So, with the Muse device, what I tend to do is I turn off any live feedback. I just kind of get my score at the end. So the answer is no. No more? No more? All right. Well, thank you very much. I just